Spring arrived early in the kingdom of, brushing the valleys with wildflowers and covering the palace gardens with white roses and pale pink peonies. Warm breezes wandered through the marble corridors of castle carrying the scent of rain and fresh earth, yet none of that gentle beauty softened the silence living inside its walls. The servants walked quietly, the fireplaces crackled without conversation, and every corridor seemed haunted by tension no one dared mention aloud. Josephine stood beside the tall dining hall windows watching petals drift across the courtyard below. At 23, she had become Duchess of only 3 months earlier, though the title felt more like a sentence than an honor. The golden wedding ring resting on her finger remained unfamiliar, cold against her skin no matter how tightly she clasped her hands together. Her marriage to Duke Adrian had not been born from affection. Her father's failing estate and mounting debts had cornered her family into desperation, while the crown demanded political unity between two noble houses threatening to collapse under rivalry. The arrangement had benefited everyone except the bride and groom forced into it. Josephine had entered the marriage hopping at the very least for kindness. Adrian had entered it already resentful. The Duke of carried a reputation that frightened even seasoned noblemen. At 25, he had already commanded soldiers in border conflicts and earned admiration from the king himself. Society praised his intelligence and discipline with the same enthusiasm it feared his temper. He rarely smiled, rarely lingered in conversation, and seemed entirely untouched by warmth. Women admired him from a distance, but none truly knew him. Josephine doubted she knew him either. Most days Adrian left the castle before sunrise for military meetings or estate matters, returning long after dusk when the halls had fallen silent. They shared meals only during formal obligations, and even then his attention rarely lifted toward her face. He addressed her simply as Duchess, never Josephine, as if speaking her name would create a closeness he refused to allow. At first she tried to bridge the distance between them. She asked about his travels. He answered with one-word replies. She attempted conversation over tea. He stood and left halfway through. Eventually she stopped trying, though each rejection settled painfully inside her chest. The loneliness became easier to endure than the humiliation. What Adrian never noticed was the quiet disaster unfolding beneath his own roof. Castle appeared magnificent from the outside, but hidden beneath its grandeur lay unpaid wages, damaged supply contracts, and debts severe enough to threaten the estate's future. Previous administrators had concealed the losses while Adrian focused on military duties, leaving the household balanced on the edge of collapse. Josephine discovered the truth accidentally while organizing neglected records in the library. After that, she could not ignore it. Every morning she woke before dawn to review account books beside candlelight. She negotiated with merchants who threatened to abandon the estate, reduced unnecessary spending, and dismissed dishonest overseers who had stolen from the household for years. When food stores dwindled near the end of winter, she quietly skipped meals so servants and stable boys could eat properly. She sold several silk gowns first, then jewelry, then the gold hair combs that had belonged to her mother. No one outside the household knew. The servants noticed, however. They saw the Duchess sewing torn curtains herself beside the kitchen fire after midnight. They saw her carrying medicine to sick workers when physicians refused to travel during storms. They saw her exhaustion deepen each passing week while she insisted everything was fine. Josephine never complained. Perhaps that was why the servants loved her so fiercely. One evening, while arranging fresh linens in the west corridor, a young maid nervously whispered, "Your Grace, you should rest, you look pale." Josephine offered a faint smile. "If I rest now, the castle may collapse entirely." The maid laughed softly, though concern lingered in her eyes. Josephine continued walking before anyone noticed the trembling in her hands. By the time spring rains arrived, fatigue had settled deeply into her body. She often woke dizzy, and sharp coughing fits interrupted her sleep during the night. Still, she ignored the symptoms. There were too many responsibilities waiting each morning, and she refused to become another burden inside a household already strained by silence. Adrian remained unaware of all of it. One particularly cold evening, rain hammered against the castle windows while thunder rolled across distant hills. Josephine sat alone beside the fireplace in the private drawing room, a book resting unopened in her lap as she listened for footsteps echoing through the corridor. Hours passed before the doors finally opened. Adrian entered without looking toward her, removing his gloves with tired irritation shadowing his sharp features. Raindrops glistened against the shoulders of his dark coat. Josephine rose carefully. "You return late." "I had work," he replied flatly. Silence followed. She hated how nervous she felt around her own husband. Gathering courage, she stepped closer. "Have I done something unforgivable?" Adrian stilled briefly, though he still did not face her completely. This marriage itself was unforgivable. The words struck harder than she expected. Josephine felt something inside her quietly crack, yet she lowered her gaze before he could notice the hurt crossing her face. "I see," she whispered. Adrian gave a short nod and walked past her toward the staircase without another word. The room felt unbearably empty after he left. For several moments Josephine remained motionless beside the fire, listening to the fatting sound of his footsteps. Then slowly she pressed trembling fingers against her mouth as a violent cough seized her chest. When she pulled her hand away, crimson stained the white fabric of her handkerchief. Outside, spring rain continued falling over Castle while Josephine stared silently at the blood in her hands, wondering how much longer her heart could survive a home that had never truly welcomed her. Spring settled fully over during the following weeks, painting the hills surrounding Castle in shades of green and gold. Sunlight spilled through towering windows each morning, illuminating polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had once seemed lifeless beneath winter gloom. Yet despite the warmth overtaking the kingdom, tension continued lingering between Josephine and Adrian like an invisible wall neither of them understood how to cross. Josephine buried herself deeper in responsibility to avoid thinking about the ache growing inside her chest. The estate's finances slowly improved under her careful management, but the progress demanded relentless effort. She spent long hours reviewing ledgers, meeting merchants, and supervising repairs across the property. Some evenings she grew so exhausted she could barely climb the staircase to her chambers without gripping the railing for support. Her coughing worsened as spring advanced. She hid it carefully from everyone except the elderly physician summoned secretly by the head maid after discovering blood-stained handkerchiefs hidden inside Josephine's dresser drawer. The physician examined her one afternoon while rain tapped against the windows. "You are overworking yourself," he warned sternly. "Your body is weakened from stress and exhaustion. If you continue like this, the illness may become dangerous." Josephine folded her trembling hands together. "The estate still needs me." "The estate will survive, you may not." She smiled sadly at that. "I cannot rest while others depend on me." The physician left with worry clouding his face, though Josephine ignored his instructions before the day had even ended. Meanwhile, whispers about unhappy marriage spread. At afternoon teas and formal gatherings, aristocrats spoke of the cold duke who despised his wife and the unfortunate duchess trapped inside a loveless union. Some Josephine. Others treated her suffering as entertainment. Adrian remained indifferent to gossip, dismissing society's opinions as meaningless noise, but Josephine could not entirely escape the humiliation attached to every whisper following her through crowded ballrooms. The spring equinox ball arrived near the end of April, hosted within the royal palace beneath ceilings painted with golden constellations. Nobles from across gathered to celebrate the changing season through music, dancing, and elaborate displays of wealth. Josephine had considered feigning illness to avoid attending altogether, but Adrian informed her coldly that their absence would provoke unnecessary speculation. "You are the Duchess of," he said while fastening silver cuffs around his wrists before departure. "People expect to see you." Josephine lowered her eyes, of course. For once, however, she decided not to disappear quietly into the background. The gown she selected was pale blue silk embroidered with delicate silver thread, simple enough to remain elegant yet striking beneath candlelight. Her dark hair rested loosely across her shoulders, adorned only by pearl pins that had belonged to her grandmother. When she descended the palace staircase beside Adrian later that evening, conversations around them faltered. Adrian noticed immediately. The realization unsettled him more than it should have. Josephine looked beautiful tonight, but not in the delicate, distant way often appeared during court events. She looked luminous beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. For the first time since their marriage began, Adrian found himself unable to look away from her completely. The attention she attracted from others irritated him even further. Young lords approached constantly throughout the evening, eager for conversation or a dance. Josephine responded politely to each interaction, smiling with quiet grace despite the exhaustion hidden behind her eyes. Adrian watched from across the ballroom while an unfamiliar frustration tightened inside his chest each time another man managed to make her laugh softly. He disliked the feeling immediately. During the third dance of the evening, Adrian stood near a marble column listening distractedly to military officials discussing border disputes when two nearby caught his attention. "Poor Duchess Josephine," one whispered. "Did you hear she sold family jewelry to pay servants after winter shortages?" The second woman sighed dramatically, and still the Duke barely acknowledges her existence. Adrian's expression hardened. "Sold jewelry? For his estate?" The conversation continued, but he heard little afterward. Unease settled heavily inside him as scattered memories resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. Josephine leaving meals untouched, worn gloves she continued repairing instead of replacing, exhaustion shadowing her face during breakfast meetings. Now they refused to leave his thoughts. By the time the ball ended, tension simmered beneath his calm exterior. Rain had begun falling again when they returned to Castle shortly before midnight. Adrian searched several rooms before finally locating Josephine inside the greenhouse attached to the eastern wing. Moonlight filtered through glass walls while rows of blooming lilies filled the air with fragrance. Josephine stood near the center table, removing pearl pins from her hair with movements. She looked startled when Adrian entered. "You should be resting," he said. A faint smile touched her lips. "I could say the same to you." He ignored the response, studying her more carefully than ever before. Shadows darkened the delicate skin beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the pins aside. "You sold your jewelry," he said. Josephine stiffened imperceptibly. "The servants needed wages." "You should have informed me. You were busy." The calm honesty in her voice unsettled him more than accusation would have. Silence stretched between them before Josephine turned toward the rain sliding down the greenhouse glass. "I heard the king may permit annulments after summer," she murmured softly. "You will finally be free of this marriage." Adrian stared at her. Instead of relief, anger surged unexpectedly through him. "Who said I wanted that?" Josephine blinked in surprise. "You said this marriage was unforgivable." His jaw tightened. "That does not mean I intend to watch another man take my wife." The words escaped before reason could stop them. Josephine's breath caught. For a moment neither moved while rain hammered against the glass ceiling overhead. Then uncertainly she whispered his name for the first time since their wedding. "Adrian." Something inside him shifted the moment he heard it. After that night in the greenhouse, Adrian could no longer look at Josephine with the same indifference that had once protected him from attachment. Her voice whispering his name lingered relentlessly in his mind, following him through military meetings, estate inspections, and sleepless nights spent staring at dark ceilings while rain tapped against distant windows. Something inside him had begun unraveling, though pride prevented him from fully understanding what it meant. Josephine noticed the change immediately. Adrian still remained reserved, but his silence no longer carried the same cold sharpness. Sometimes she caught him watching her across crowded rooms with an expression she could not decipher. Other times he appeared unexpectedly beside her during meals, lingering several moments longer than usual before leaving for his duties. The distance between them remained, yet its edges no longer felt impossible to cross. That frightened her more than his cruelty once had. Hope was dangerous, especially for someone who had already learned how easily affection could disappear. Several days after the spring equinox ball, Adrian entered the estate library searching for financial reports regarding his remaining debts. Instead, he uncovered records revealing the full extent of Josephine's sacrifices. Payment receipts carried her signature beside canceled loans and renewed merchant contracts. Hidden among the documents were notices proving she had sold family heirlooms to stabilize household accounts during winter shortages. Adrian stared at the papers in disbelief. The realization settled heavily in his chest. While he spent months resenting the marriage forced upon him, Josephine had quietly preserved the very estate carrying his family's name. Without recognition, without gratitude, without complaint, a sharp wave of shame struck him unexpectedly. He summoned the head housekeeper later that afternoon, demanding answers with a harshness born more from guilt than anger. The older woman hesitated before speaking carefully. Her Grace never wished the Duke to know. "Why?" "Because she feared burdening you." The words landed harder than any accusation. Adrian dismissed the servants afterward and remained alone inside his study for nearly an hour, staring silently at the fireplace while memories resurfaced with brutal clarity. Josephine standing quietly during formal dinners while he ignored her completely. Josephine waiting beside windows late into the night for his return. Josephine asking in a trembling voice whether she had done something unforgivable. And his cruel response. For the first time in years, Adrian felt disgusted with himself. Sleep abandoned him completely after that day. Each morning he found excuses to remain closer to Josephine without directly approaching her. He observed her supervising gardeners beneath blooming cherry trees despite visible exhaustion weakening her posture. He noticed how frequently coughing interrupted her breathing when she believed herself alone. Once he discovered her asleep over financial ledgers inside the library long after midnight, candlelight flickering across pale skin shadowed by fatigue. Carefully, so she would not wake, Adrian draped his coat around her shoulders before leaving quietly. The following morning he any knowledge of it. Josephine suspected the truth anyway. Neither acknowledged the growing tension between them. Late one evening, Adrian returned unexpectedly early from the capital after concluding military negotiations ahead of schedule. Thunderclouds rolled heavily across the sky, darkening castle beneath approaching storms. As servants hurried through corridors securing windows against rising winds, Adrian searched instinctively for Josephine without fully understanding why. He found her in the west hallway speaking softly with two maids carrying baskets of clean linens. The moment she tried stepping forward, her balance faltered. Josephine steadied herself quickly against the wall before anyone reacted, but Adrian noticed immediately. Concern tightened his expression as the servants exchanged worried glances. "You should rest," he said sharply after the maids departed. "I am fine. You are pale." She attempted a faint smile. "You sound concerned, Your Grace." "I am irritated," he corrected harshly, though neither of them believed it. Lightning flashed suddenly beyond nearby windows, illuminating exhaustion across Josephine's delicate features. Adrian stepped closer than usual, studying her with growing unease. "When did you last see the physician?" Her gaze shifted away. "It is unnecessary." "That was not my question." Before she could answer, a violent coughing fit seized her body. Josephine turned away instinctively, pressing a handkerchief against her lips while struggling to steady her breathing. Adrian reached toward her automatically, but froze when crimson stained the white fabric between her fingers. For one horrifying second, neither spoke. Adrian felt cold terror spread through his chest. Josephine quickly hid the handkerchief behind her back. "It is nothing." "Nothing," his voice darkened dangerously. "You are coughing blood." "It will pass." "How long has this been happening?" Silence answered him. Adrian's composure fractured completely. "Josephine." She looked exhausted suddenly, as though months of carefully hidden pain had become too heavy to carry alone. "Please do not be angry." The quiet plea destroyed something inside him. Before Adrian could respond, Josephine swayed violently. Her knees gave out beneath her. He caught her before she struck the marble floor. "Josephine!" Her body felt frighteningly fragile in his arms. Weak breaths trembled against his chest while another cough stained the front of his coat crimson. Outside, thunder shook the castle walls as servants rushed forward in alarm, but Adrian barely heard them over the panic roaring through his mind. Fear unlike anything he had known consumed him entirely. Not battlefield fear. Not political fear. The unbearable terror of losing someone precious before realizing how deeply they mattered. He lifted Josephine into his arms and carried her through the storm-dark corridors himself while servants hurried ahead to summon physicians. Rain battered the castle windows violently as Adrian remained beside her bed long after doctors began treatment, refusing every request to leave the room. For 3 days, Josephine drifted in and out of fevered unconsciousness. And for 3 days, Adrian never left her side. Royal messengers arrived demanding his presence in the capital. He ignored them. Military officials requested urgent meetings. He dismissed them immediately. Sleep became meaningless while Josephine remained pale and unmoving beneath linen blankets. The servants watched in stunned silence as their cold duke carefully cooled her forehead with damp cloths during fevered nights. Sometimes Adrian sat motionless beside the bed, holding her hand with desperate intensity, as though releasing her even briefly might allow death to steal her away. On the third night, Josephine finally stirred awake beneath dim candlelight. Adrian straightened instantly beside her. Her lashes fluttered weakly before tired eyes met his. Confusion crossed her expression as she noticed his disheveled appearance, the exhaustion darkening his face, and the way his fingers still gripped her hand tightly. "Why are you here?" she whispered hoarsely. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Then, with every wall inside him finally shattered, he answered in a voice raw with emotion. "Because I love you." Josephine stared at Adrian in stunned silence. Certain fever had distorted her hearing. Candlelight flickered across the exhausted lines of his face while thunder rumbled faintly beyond the castle walls, but his expression remained sincere. The proud Duke sat beside her bed, gripping her trembling hand as though it anchored him to life itself. Tears gathered slowly in Josephine's eyes. Adrian lowered his gaze, shame shadowing his features. "I should have realized it sooner," he admitted quietly. "You were suffering while I punished you for a marriage neither of us chose." For months she had imagined hearing gentle words from him. Now that they finally existed, they felt almost unbearable. Adrian brushed trembling fingers carefully against her cheek. "When I told you this marriage was unforgivable, I convinced myself distance would protect us both." His voice roughened. "Then I nearly lost you." A tear escaped down Josephine's face. Adrian leaned forward slowly until his forehead rested against her hand. Please do not leave me behind. The vulnerability in his voice shattered the final barrier around her heart. Josephine touched his hair weakly, and Adrian lifted his head immediately, watching her as though afraid she might disappear if he blinked. You truly frighten me too, she whispered. Relief broke across his expression. Carefully, as though she were something precious beyond measure, Adrian kissed her. Months of loneliness, guilt, longing, and fear poured into that single moment while rain continued falling quietly outside their windows. Josephine felt warmth spread through her aching chest for the first time since entering castle. Not obligation, not duty, love. The following weeks transformed the atmosphere of completely. Josephine remained weak during recovery, yet Adrian refused to let her face anything alone again. Every morning he ensured physicians visited her chambers before attending estate matters. He brought meals himself when she lacked strength to leave bed, ignoring her protests. You are treating me like fragile glass, Josephine complained one afternoon while he adjusted blankets around her shoulders. You collapsed in my arms, Adrian replied calmly. I intend never to witness such terror again. The servants noticed the change immediately. The once distant Duke lingered constantly beside his wife, accompanying her through gardens during evening walks and abandoning meetings early whenever she appeared tired. At first the attention embarrassed her. Eventually it became comforting. As spring softened toward early summer, Josephine regained strength steadily beneath Adrian's care. They spent quiet afternoons together in the palace gardens surrounded by blooming roses and drifting petals. Adrian often read aloud while Josephine rested beneath shaded trees, listening to the calm rhythm of his voice. One evening they wandered through the western gardens after sunset, while fireflies glimmered across the grass like scattered stars. Adrian removed his coat and draped it around Josephine when cool winds brushed against her skin. You always do that now, she murmured. Do what? Take care of me. His expression softened immediately, because no one cared for you when they should have. Josephine stopped walking. Moonlight illuminated Adrian's face as he looked toward her with painful honesty. I failed you, he said quietly. Every lonely night in this castle was my fault. You were hurting too, she answered gently. That does not excuse cruelty. Josephine reached for his hand. No, but it explains it. Adrian stared at her for several moments before pulling her carefully into his arms. I do not deserve your forgiveness, he whispered against her hair. She smiled faintly, perhaps not. A surprised laugh escaped him. Then Josephine leaned closer and kissed him softly beneath the moonlit trees, silencing every remaining doubt between them. News of the Duke's transformation spread quickly through. Nobles who once mocked unhappy marriage now whispered in disbelief over Adrian's devotion to his wife. Nothing mattered beyond the quiet happiness gradually filling castle. Laughter returned to its corridors. Music drifted from open windows during warm evenings while servants smiled more freely than they had in years. Josephine no longer carried the estate's burdens alone because Adrian insisted on sharing every responsibility beside her. They reviewed financial records together and rode through nearby villages side by side speaking with tenants. For the first time since childhood, Adrian began looking forward to returning home each night. One rainy afternoon, Josephine discovered him waiting inside the library beside the fireplace with tea already prepared. She paused in surprise. You remembered my favorite blend. I remember everything about you now, Adrian answered. Heat rose instantly to her cheeks. Adrian crossed the room slowly before taking her hands between his own. I spent months pretending this marriage imprisoned me, he admitted quietly, but loving you has been the first freedom I have ever truly known. Emotion tightened inside Josephine's chest. She had loved him silently through loneliness and heartbreak without expecting anything in return. Now the man who once avoided even speaking her name looked at her like she was the center of his entire world. Adrian, she whispered. He smiled softly. There is my name again. Josephine laughed quietly before resting against him, while rain tapped gently against the castle windows. By midsummer the gardens surrounding overflowed with roses and blue hydrangeas. One warm evening Josephine stood on the balcony watching fireflies dance above the glowing fields below, while distant music drifted from the servants' summer celebration in the courtyard. Adrian approached silently behind her and slipped his arms around her waist. Still planning to leave after summer, he murmured teasingly. Josephine smiled as she leaned back against his chest. I suppose I can tolerate you a little longer. He laughed softly before turning her toward him. Stay for every spring after this, he whispered. Josephine touched his face carefully, remembering the lonely man who once feared love enough to destroy it before it could touch him. Then she rose onto her toes and kissed him beneath the summer stars, knowing Castle had finally become the home both their hearts had been searching for all along.